I'm a graffiti artist. Some might call it art, others call it vandalism. Either way, it's my passion, and I'm pretty good at it. But if there's one thing I've learned about the tagging scene, it's that respect is dead. The community's harsh, territorial, unfriendly, with zero appreciation for each other's work. Because of that, I've developed a bit of a solo routine. I look for the quiet spots, the ones where nobody else bothers to go. Places where my tags won't be defaced within hours. And old train lines? They're perfect. Abandoned train cars sit forgotten on these lines, out of sight, out of mind. You'll find trains that haven't moved in years, rusting in solitude. Sometimes a new one even appears, transferred there for reasons no one seems to question. It's like hitting a jackpot for an artist looking to avoid competition. One night, I took my friend Lucas with me. He's not into the whole tagging thing, but he doesn't mind coming along. Out of everyone I know, he respects my art and doesn't give me grief for spending hours with a can in hand. Most of my other friends don't get it. They think it's a waste of time, or worse, an easy way to get in trouble. But Lucas, he just gets it. That night, we found ourselves wandering down a forgotten set of tracks I'd scouted out earlier on Google Maps, passing an old rusted freight train in complete darkness. We were both a little stoned. Mostly him, really, but I joined in to match his vibe. It wasn't even that late, maybe a little past 10 p.m. I could still feel the buzz as I stared up at this untouched train, clean of any tags or scribbles. That was unusual. Most abandoned cars are already covered in layers of paint. But this one? It looked like it had just been dropped there, waiting for someone to come along and mark it up. I handed Lucas a can, just for fun, and got to work. The sound of paint hissing from the can was oddly comforting in the silence of the night. I finished one tag, then moved to the next car, and then another. 15 minutes passed, and I'd gone through 2 cans, laying down 3 tags that lined up perfectly. They looked good, better than I'd expected. In the thrill of the moment, I chucked my empty cans behind me, listening to them clatter down the tracks, the metal ball bearings rattling inside as they bounced away. I turned back to Lucas, who was too engrossed in his second joint to notice. For context, I don't smoke much. Every time I get high, it's a gamble. I'll either have a good time or be overwhelmed with anxiety. That night, I took the risk, puffing on his joint, despite knowing it could mess with my nerves, especially with us being out here, doing something illegal. I felt fine, until we heard it. A muffled clang echoed from behind us, the kind of sound that makes every hair on your neck stand on end. Lucas and I froze. It was impossible to tell where the noise came from. Had someone just stepped on one of my discarded cans? Was it inside one of the train cars? We stood there, silently scanning the shadows, trying to convince ourselves it was just our imaginations. But the air was thick with tension. After a minute of total silence, I pulled out my phone, recording with a shaky hand. "Bro, did you hear that?" My voice barely cracked above a whisper, but Lucas nodded, his eyes wide with nerves. Then, as if on cue, a can flew through the darkness, skidding to a stop just inches from us. I hadn't thrown it. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I stared at the can, still rocking back and forth from its momentum. Then we heard the footsteps, slow, heavy, approaching with a menace that hit me harder than any high ever could. And then a voice, low and taunting, called out, "You better not trip, boy." That was all we needed. We took off, sprinting down the tracks without a second thought. In my panic, I didn't even notice the sound of a gunshot until it shattered the silence behind us, sending Lucas stumbling forward. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I tried to keep my phone recording. But I was too rattled. I fumbled, the video cutting out as we bolted down the tracks, lungs burning until we finally hit the main road. We didn't stop until we reached the car, both of us too shaken to say a word on the way home. The police? Not an option. I couldn't exactly report the guy without admitting what we were doing out there. For weeks, that night replayed in my head, but my curiosity refused to die. Eventually, I went back to those tracks, this time during the day and with my Glock for protection. The train was still there, untouched, but something had changed. The 3 spots where I'd left my tags had been painted over in thick, messy blotches of red, almost as if someone had smeared it in a hurry. And then I noticed one of the train cars with its door wide open. Inside was a single metal chair, placed dead center, ropes tied around its legs, and chains lying haphazardly around it. The floor reeked of bleach, so strong it stung my nose. It was like someone had tried to erase every trace of whatever had been there. The whole scene was sickeningly surreal. I pulled out my phone to snap a picture, but as soon as I raised it, I heard a clang, faint but unmistakable, from somewhere deeper down the train. I didn't need another sign. I was out of there in seconds, leaving behind any remaining curiosity. I've shared this story with others, but no one can explain that night in a way that makes sense. I still don't know if that guy was genuinely dangerous or just some crazed loner who'd staked his claim on those tracks. Either way, I haven't been back since, and sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear that gunshot echoing in my mind, like a reminder of just how close we came to something far worse. It's early July as I write this. The memory of what happened still as sharp as when it occurred. The story took place at the beginning of summer, when I usually try to travel or stay near my college town to avoid going back home. But this time, life threw me a curveball, and I had no choice but to return to my hometown. I told myself I only had to make it through 1 week, and then I'd be on a plane to Germany, escaping into the thrill of adventure. Home felt stifling, and I wasn't in the mood to reconnect with old friends, but I wasn't about to sit around all day either. I took to exploring, spending my days hiking, watching movies, or driving around aimlessly. But after several days of this routine, I was craving something more. I wanted that edge, that taste of adrenaline I'd almost forgotten. One activity lingered in my mind, something I hadn't dared to try in years: train hopping. Back in the day, my friends and I had pushed each other to be reckless, to push boundaries. Train hopping was the thrill of all thrills back then. A quick rush of danger and the exhilaration of feeling invincible. And even though I'd long since left that part of my life behind, I found myself slipping back into that old mindset, daring myself. What's one last time, I thought. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my keys and drove to a secluded spot where I knew the freight trains still ran. The tracks were nestled between thick trees and overgrown flora, hidden from main roads. Freight trains passed regularly here, and I knew I'd have plenty of chances to hop on. The layout was familiar. Just ahead, the tracks led into a dark, winding tunnel that opened into a small clearing on the other side before crossing a massive bridge. In the past, my friends and I had always ridden the train all the way across the bridge, but I'd be going solo this time. I wasn't about to hike back miles to my car. Instead, I'd hop on, ride through the tunnel, and then jump off to walk back along the tracks. The day was hot, the sun glaring down as I paced by the tracks, waiting for the distant rumble of a train. It was mid-afternoon, probably around 2 or 3, when I finally felt the familiar vibration in the rails. As the train approached, I ducked behind a tree, trying to stay out of sight. Although most freight conductors didn't care about people hanging around, I gripped the ladder tightly, my pulse quickening, hoping it wasn't anything dangerous. Then the tunnel swallowed the train in darkness. Suddenly, I felt a cold, unyielding grip on my leg. The sensation was so unexpected that my mind went blank, pure survival mode kicking in. I yelled, my voice swallowed by the roar of the train, and tried to kick whatever had grabbed me. I had no idea who or what was behind me, but I felt a vice-like grip, pulling, dragging. My fingers were white-knuckled around the ladder, clinging for dear life. I managed to pull my leg free, only to feel another hand, a firm, icy touch slapping against my calf. This time, I didn't dare look down. I just scrambled up the ladder, panting and heart pounding. I don't know how long I held on, paralyzed by fear, as the train thundered through the tunnel. The darkness was suffocating, and every sound was amplified in the eerie silence between each roar of the wheels. When we finally emerged into daylight on the other side, I jumped off without a second thought, stumbling as I hit the ground. My legs shook as I tried to catch my breath, struggling to process what had just happened. I glanced around, feeling the stillness of the clearing. It was peaceful here, the sunlight streaming down in stark contrast to the dark tunnel behind me. But that peace was short-lived. Reality hit me hard. The only way back to my car was through that tunnel. And now, all I could think of was the hand that had tried to drag me into the shadows. Panic set in as I weighed my options. I couldn't cross the bridge safely without risking another train, and I wasn't about to call the police for help. I was breaking the law just by being here. Every escape route seemed riskier than the last, and with a deep breath, I accepted that my only option was to go back through the tunnel. Grabbing a jagged rock, I steeled myself, hoping it might offer some protection if it came to that. As I entered the tunnel, the darkness seemed even more consuming. Each step echoed, the sound amplifying and distorting. Halfway in, just as I neared where I'd felt the hands, a faint sound pierced the silence. It was a clicking noise, like someone clucking their tongue, or maybe something metallic scraping. It was close, too close. My body froze, and for a moment, every hair on my neck stood up. Whoever or whatever was in here wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, deciding to bluff. "Stay back!" I shouted, trying to sound menacing. "I have a gun." Of course I didn't, but I hope my voice carried enough fear to make it believable. The clicking stopped abruptly. Silence. Then, summoning every ounce of bravery I had, I pulled up a gunshot sound effect on my phone, cranked up the volume, and pressed play. The sound ricocheted through the tunnel, booming and echoing in a way that was far louder than I'd anticipated. For a brief moment, silence followed, and I could feel something retreat in the darkness. Without giving it another thought, I bolted. I ran through the pitch black, legs pumping, ignoring the pain in my muscles. My mind was racing, and every step felt like it could be my last, the threat always just behind me. When I finally burst out of the tunnel, gasping, I turned to look back, only to freeze in terror. From the shadows within, two silhouettes stood on the tracks, unmoving, just watching me. My pulse hammered as I stared, their forms blurry but undeniably human, yet not quite right. And then a sound split the air, a low guttural screech like nothing I'd ever heard. It was human, but at the same time, it was off. Raw, primal, like a warning. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, leaving that tunnel and those figures behind me. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered in that tunnel, and part of me doesn't want to. All I know is that it was real, and I'll never ever go train hopping again. Working for the MTA in New York City, you see a lot of things that would make most people nervous, if not downright terrified. But after 7 years on the job, I was used to it all. The unpredictable commuters, the occasional unsettling encounter with someone who seemed a bit off, and even the rare rat that would dart across the station. I thought I'd seen everything. At least, that's what I believed. Then, 2 years ago, something happened that I can't shake, no matter how much time has passed. It was late, a routine shift in Brooklyn's High Street station. This particular station always had an eerie feeling about it, especially when empty. High Street is usually overflowing with commuters, but that night it was different. Not a single soul was on the platform. The quiet was almost unnatural, amplified by the distant hum of flickering lights and the occasional echo of a train rushing by. It was strange being there alone, surrounded by shadows, but I brushed it off, continuing my maintenance tasks like usual. Hours passed, and the silence started to feel oppressive. I had gotten into the rhythm of my work when suddenly a loud clang echoed from somewhere deep within the tunnel. It was so unexpected and jarring that I dropped my mop, my heart racing as I spun around to face the darkness. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before, at least not like that. It was heavy and metallic, like a rock slamming against a rail. I paused, listening intently, but there was only silence. I figured it had to be something harmless, maybe a loose piece of debris falling, or even an animal. Still, something about the sound gnawed at me. The subway tunnels are ancient, and strange sounds aren't unheard of, but this felt different. It was almost as if the darkness itself had come alive. Shaking off the thought, I convinced myself to continue my work. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. But not even 10 minutes later, the same sound echoed through the tunnel, this time louder, sharper. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. Twice in such a short span? Now I was starting to feel genuinely unnerved. Trying to stay calm, I walked over to the tunnel's edge and peered into the darkness. I was tempted to call out, but decided against it. There was no way anyone was down there, right? Even with the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine, I went back to my work, trying to push the sounds to the back of my mind. But they lingered, like shadows in my thoughts, as I finished up my tasks. Just as I was about to leave the platform, a new sound froze me in place. A child's voice, weak and pleading, echoing from deep within the tunnel. The voice was calling for help. In that moment, any fear I had was replaced by instinct. A child alone in the subway tunnels? That was a risk no one should ever take. I immediately went to the edge of the platform, peering into the darkness, my heart pounding. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The sound of my own voice in the empty station was unsettling. At first, there was no reply. I strained to hear, and after a pause, the voice came again, soft and frightened. "Help, I'm here." The voice was distant but clear, and it sounded like he was scared and hurt. I hesitated. Everything inside me screamed that this was a bad idea, that something was off, but I couldn't leave a child to fend for himself in those tunnels. Taking a deep breath, I stepped down onto the tracks, trying to see better. "Where are you?" I called, slowly making my way down the tunnel. "Are you hurt?" The tunnel seemed darker than usual, the shadows dense and heavy around me. There was a long silence, then, faintly, the child's voice again. "I'm just ahead. Keep walking." I felt my stomach drop, a creeping unease settling in. Something about the way he said it didn't feel right. Why wasn't he telling me what was wrong? Why wasn't he moving closer to me? But I forced myself to keep going, calling out, hoping for more answers. As I moved deeper into the darkness, my eyes slowly adjusted, and finally, I could make out a small shadow up ahead, huddled near the wall of the tunnel. Relief washed over me. I could actually see him. But then, my heart stopped. Standing just behind the child was a taller figure, almost blending into the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but the figure was unmistakably there, looming behind him. My blood ran cold, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Every instinct told me to get out of there, to run as fast as I could back to the platform. I took a step back, and as I did, the child's voice echoed through the tunnel again. Only this time it sounded different, eerily calm, almost amused. "Where are you going?" The voice no longer held that frightened tone. Instead, it sent a chill down my spine. In that moment, I knew something was horribly wrong. With every ounce of self-control, I turned, trying not to draw attention, and started walking back to the platform, keeping my pace steady. My heart raced as I felt the weight of their eyes on my back, those shadows watching me. Finally, I reached the platform, scrambling up the steps and not stopping until I had service to call the police. I could barely speak, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd heard and seen. They arrived quickly, their radios crackling as they spread out across the platform and down into the tunnels, flashlights cutting through the darkness. After what felt like hours, one of the officers emerged from the tunnel, his face pale. In his hand, he held a single child's shoe, small and worn, covered in dust. They hadn't found anyone down there, not a trace of the child or the taller figure, but the shoe was enough to make my stomach turn. They told me that they'd keep searching, running checks for any missing child cases, but nothing ever turned up. No one matched the description of what I'd seen. In the following weeks, I replayed that night over and over, trying to make sense of it. The more I thought about it, the more the possibilities haunted me. Was it some deranged person using a child's voice as bait to lure unsuspecting people into the darkness? Or was it something even darker, something beyond explanation, lurking in the shadows of the subway? I still don't know. But every time I pass High Street Station now, I find myself glancing into the tunnel, half expecting to see those shadows again. And sometimes, just for a split second, I think I hear the faint echo of a child's voice, calling out for help.